Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It is the 8th of November, 2012, and we have special guests here, Veronica Boix-Mansilla and Tony Jackson. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Did I do okay, Veronica?
Hello? Yes?
Did I do okay with your name?
Yes. Oh, you did beautifully.
Perfect,
and it was a tall order.
Well, a guy with a last name Hargadon has to do some things right. The Future of Education is sponsored by my Web 2.0 Labs project, web20labs.com. Thanks to Mighty Bell and Blackboard Collaborate for support. I'm on my Hack Your Education tour, which is a lot of fun. I'm actually sitting outside of Panera Bread on my way to Philadelphia for a fun set of sessions tomorrow. Can't wait for those who are going to be there. Coming up next week, our massive global education conference. This is so much fun, 5 days, 24 hours a day. We sure hope that you will consider attending to globaleducationconference.com. It is free, and over 400 sessions, terrific keynotes. This interview tonight is kind of a prelude to that, so we're going to touch on some topics and themes here which are very important. If you missed the Learning 2.0 conference or the Library 2.012 conference, those recordings are all up online and free as well. Coming up on the Future of Education, next week is the Global Education Conference on November 20th. Kiran Birsetti on teaching kids to take charge. Can't wait for that. Charles Hayes on Self-University after that. Jim Groom on the domain of one's own. Ray McNulty on schools. Cal Newport comes back to talk about why skills trump passion. Can't wait to, he's always challenging, Cal is. Then, tonight, announcing for the first time, we have some really fun events coming up. The School Leadership Summit, co-sponsored by TCAL, will take place on March 28th, a virtual conference. Then on April 23rd to 25th, I'm going to get shot for that. Hewlett-Packard is helping to sponsor a worldwide STEM conference. Then on May 3rd through 5th, the RSCon and Reform Symposium, and then on May 16th, a worldwide homeschool conference. So much fun coming up. If you've missed any of the shows, they are all recorded in full Blackboard Collaborate form in an MP3. Yale Wishnick talked to us last week about a culture of dependency. And a fascinating discussion with someone who's worked heavily in California schools and looking at the larger ramifications of the school system. Jamie McMillan talked about legendary learners, Denise Pope from Stanford, on all kinds of things, including success. Anyway, lots up there, hopefully something of interest to you that makes it worth listening to. So this is your chance to let us know where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map for the star icon. Click on the star and click on it again, and then click on the map. Feel free to shout out in the chat as well. Like I said, I just drove past long gas lines in New York, which was no surprise, but I had forgotten that that was still going on. Tony, we can hear a little background noise from your mic. I think I'm going to recommend that you turn your microphone off when you're not talking, and then turn it back on when you are. Yep, just go ahead and perfect. So wherever you're participating from, we're sure glad to have you here. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks again to Tony and Veronica for being a part of this. There is a Mighty Bell for this session. Mighty Bell is the new project from Gina Bianchini. It's a curation and conversation piece. I'm going to put the address in the chat. I put some links to Tony and Veronica's material in that Mighty Bell, and you can continue the conversation there. Okay, so this is really fun. I did load your slides, Veronica. Honor sent some slides. Your slides actually were pretty much identical, except you had more material. So you have those slides at your disposal if you would like them. I'd love for the two of you to each introduce yourself, though, briefly, and kind of tell the story of how you came together on this publication. And Veronica, can I start with you?
Yes, absolutely. So, I'm a researcher at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and for many years I've been doing work on how young people come to think in disciplinary terms, in terms of history and biology and the arts, and in interdisciplinary terms, and how they come to understand complex problems through interdisciplinary lenses. And it was through a project that dealt with students' understanding of globalization and teachers' understanding of the phenomenon of globalization that I thought about a phenomenon that I was observing among all of us, the teachers and the researchers and the students in that particular research project, that I came to call global consciousness. Because we were enhancing our awareness of the world around us and enhancing a sense of belonging, if you wish, to a world that was much, much larger as we became aware of the phenomenon of globalization, a world that was much, much larger than the world with which we began this project. I wrote that paper in collaboration with Howard Gardner, my colleague at Project Zero, and I hear, Tony, that you got a hold of that paper, and I was very pleased to be invited by Tony for what turned out to be a groundbreaking initiative by the Asia Society. I had always been an admirer of the Asia Society. So a groundbreaking initiative that Tony led with the CCSSO to define global competence for education in America and beyond today.
So Tony, let's have you do the same if you would.
Sure, and I also hearing Veronica, so if I repeat anything, when our stories come together, I'm sorry. Basically, it was about 12 years ago that the Asia Society took a good hard look at what students in schools knew about Asia and about the world, and what teachers were teaching about Asia and the world, and found in both instances it was rather little in both cases. So that launched a decade-long effort to think about ways in which Asia Society and other organizations could be instrumental in developing what we later came to call greater global competence among youth, among students in American schools and schools around the world, frankly. And so I came on board at Asia Society in 2003 because we felt as though, in addition to work in kind of the advocacy community to have global competence be a greater priority for American education, there needed to be actual proof points on the ground of what an education that really blended a global focus with a college preparatory curriculum could look like, and how you could actually bring together global knowledge and awareness with learning within the disciplines. So we started the International Studies Schools network of schools that are really small, globally focused, initially secondary schools, but now middle schools and elementary schools as well, that take this idea forward, and from everything from the culture to the curriculum instruction and assessment to the way in which the school relates to the community, tries to actualize this notion of a globally focused education. And in that context, we realized we really needed to be very clear and definitive about what we meant by global competence. And so that led to an opportunity to work with the Council of Chief State School Officers as part of their EdSteps project to form a task force, of which Veronica was a distinguished member, and think deeply together and look at other resources from around the world as to what we really meant by global competence. And that eventually resulted in the book that's featured on the screen now that Veronica and I had the pleasure of working together to create. So that's how we have come to work together and how we advance this notion within our book.
Thanks, Tony.
And that is how we continue to work together in unity.
Yes, how nice. So, Veronica, I spent a year when I was in high school living in Brazil. I was part of an exchange program, the AFS program. Do you think that gave me a specific set of skills or understanding that are unique? And is the idea of global competence related to the kind of understanding that I would have gotten in that experience?
I think that's a great question because it raises the question to you as to what exactly it was that you did in Brazil when you were there for a year. How alert were you? Were you, for example, in an American school in Brazil with the expat community and not interacting much with the local, with local Brazilians, or were you immersed trying to understand and focused on trying to make sense of this new reality in which you lived? So, for example, did you have a chance to learn a little bit of Portuguese? Did you have a chance to understand the phenomenon of tudo bem, for instance, which is an expression that is literally translated as it's all right or all is right, but yet it has a very, very deep cultural meaning. It just connects people immediately, as people say, tudo bem to each other. So what happened during that year, and how sort of the experience that you had, the level of connection with Brazilian history, Brazilian culture, Brazilian people, Brazilian friends, will determine the degree to which you left that experience with a more complex and richer intellectual and emotional understanding of this environment, this cultural context, or not.
So I loved how you described that. I would say one of the biggest and most significant parts of my experience in Brazil, and yes, I did learn Portuguese, and yes, I did study in a Brazilian school, and it was an immersion program, I lived with a Brazilian family, was my ability to see the world outside of the context in which I had grown up. And I often will use the word meta to relate to that, sort of a meta level of understanding. But Tony, that's clearly just only a part of the framework, sort of understanding the world and the dimensions of global competence. So can we use that as kind of a springboard, Tony, to talk about what those four elements are?
Sure, and I'll make sure my microphone's on. Yeah. Well, let me preface it by saying, though, that one of the things we want to really think is important to kind of realize is that the four kind of pillars of global competence that I'll describe in just a second, they rest on an ability for students to sort of develop their understanding of the world and develop their capacities in these ways through deep disciplinary and interdisciplinary study. You don't develop global competence outside of the curriculum, as it were. It really is an investigation of the curriculum and using it as a platform to develop one's global competence. So young people need to understand from a historical perspective, to think like historians, or to think like scientists, but they need to think in those ways from a global perspective. So it's kind of important to note that there's a kind of an undergirding assumption in our notion of global competence that it's derived from deep disciplinary and interdisciplinary study. But the core tenets really, first of all, it's this notion of being able to investigate the world. And by that we mean that students are able to, first of all, frame important questions from a global perspective, and then to be able to use a wide variety of resources, from international resources that they're able to access through digital technology, to put those resources and ideas together in a compelling evidence-based argument, and then to be able to create a persuasive presentation of ideas that takes into consideration multiple perspectives and uses that knowledge to really kind of advance an understanding of the phenomenon. So that's the whole notion of investigating the world as a core element of it. Then there is the notion of recognizing perspectives. And when you were speaking about your experience in Brazil, that came to mind that what you were doing, what you were developing there, was an ability to kind of, first of all, understand that you yourself have a perspective that others may not share, but that then there is an opportunity to look at the world from other viewpoints. And what I think is important here is that it's not just a matter of sort of observing that there are other viewpoints, but rather bringing those viewpoints into your own consciousness and sort of reshaping your own worldview through the interaction of your perspective with others. Then there is the idea of communicating ideas. And here we're talking about the phenomenon where young people begin to develop an understanding that audiences differ in their perception of sometimes the very same information, and by virtue of culture or ideology or religion or background or many factors, there are differences that one needs to take into consideration as to how both to communicate with and how to understand and look at the perspective of others in order to be able to communicate effectively. And in my view, that also kind of bleeds over into the notion of being able to collaborate with people and to work in cross-cultural teams and to be able to bring ideas across cultural bounds is an important part of being able to communicate ideas. And then a very important aspect of our concept of global competence is the notion of taking action. And that is really, here we're talking about the kind of not only learning about the world, but making a difference in the world and applying one's knowledge to, again, frame important questions, but then actually to pursue those questions either individually or collaboratively so that you actually consider consequences, but then move forward in advocating and trying to make a difference in the world for the common good, as it were, based on your knowledge. So those are really the four key tenets of what we think of as global competence.
So, Veronica, I'm really interested by this because my experience in Brazil is maybe a good way for me to frame the next question. It wasn't nearly as neat and organized as this, and for me as an individual, there's a little bit of messiness involved in coming to that perspective and learning to investigate the world and communicating ideas. Is there a danger when you put it in this kind of a framework that it becomes a little bit of a grocery list for educators? And how do you move past kind of a checklist into really, I mean, these are really important times and really important global issues. How do you help make sure that this is actually kind of real?
Gosh, I am so pleased that you brought this up because, in a way, part of the challenge that we face in education reform today is the problem of sort of the grammar of schooling, sort of this tradition that we have created in schools by which everything becomes a bullet point and everything becomes a bit of information that needs to be mastered. It becomes a grid, it becomes a checklist. So I am really pleased about the fact that you bring this up because while we have tried to organize some of these ideas in a way that analytically holds together, in no way are these silo enterprises. So as you're investigating the world, for example, as you're trying to figure out, for example, the origins of Carnival in Brazil, because you find yourself, having to prepare for this February event, and you want to find out a little bit about what it means. So all of a sudden, you find yourself not only reading a little bit about it because you're curious about it, but at the same time, you're chatting with your friends who are preparing their outfits, and you come to understand that this means an enormous amount, that there's an enormous amount of tradition, that families gather together, that young people are free and participate in Carnival, that Carnival is an incredibly public event, and there's no way in which the world organizes itself around this chart. What we can do is use the chart as a lens to try to pay attention to particular aspects of what otherwise feels like a very complex experience. And this is one of the reasons why we have tried in the book that Tony and I wrote, we have tried to highlight the importance of good examples, sort of good cases, good practices in which sort of in the messiness of practice, in the messiness of trying to understand how fax machines travel around the world, as one of our cases suggests from Reggio Emilia, we can use that frame of the quadrants that Tony was describing in order to see what matters, what should I pay attention to, how can I give a little bit of order to this naturally messy back and forth practice of understanding a complex topic or making sense of a complex experience, so that I can be a little bit more deliberate about where to focus my attention as an educator or as a learner myself. So I could do two things at this point, and you let me know what you think might make more sense. One is I could unpack this example of sort of early childhood Reggio Emilia exploration of fax machines. Or we could go back to your case of Brazil to try to see particular experiences that you may have had in Brazil as you were growing up, and then we could apply that framework to try to distill aspects of your experience. What would you like?
So I'd love to have. I'd love to go through a couple of these examples that you have. Would this be a good one for you, Veronica? And then maybe Tony, you could think of is one of the other ones that's in the slide deck maybe good for you to speak on, and I'll let the two of you kind of figure that out. But yes, I would love to see. I think our audience would love to hear some examples here, and this might be a good one to start with.
Okay, and I can start with this one, and I'm sure that Tony has sort of a collection of examples to choose from, whether there are sort of in our slides or not. So so the image that you see in front of you is a construction of children of ages around 5 in Reggio Emilia, which is a very, very powerful early childhood learning center in Reggio in Italy. Of course, now the method of Reggio Emilia is being applied sort of across the ages. But what these kids are trying to figure out and depicting in this image is how it is that they could send a fax. How it is that they could send a message to a friend that had moved from Reggio in Italy to the United States and Washington, D.C., how they could send a fax or a message as fast as possible. One of the children comes up with this idea that a fax machine exists and it sends messages instantly, and they are charged with trying to figure out how it is that faxes fly around the world. So the teachers do not explain a fax machine. They do not request definitions of a fax machine. They do not provide too much initial information about a fax machine. And the kids construct their own intuitive theories about how the world works, what's the territory that this fax needs to cover. So it needs to go across an ocean. And at some point, one of the kids mentions the fact that it probably needs to pass through Ireland, and he saw that there were mountains in Ireland, so he needed to draw some mountains for Ireland, and the ocean has birds and boats, and the ocean is really very big, and there's life under the ocean, and maybe this fax machine is carried by birds, the paper is carried by birds, or it goes under a tunnel under the ocean. So they're trying to figure out, how this message goes across, travels across the world. And they're bringing together all of their prior experience, which is not too extensive as they are only 5, to try to depict the planet and what they know about the planet. What you see there is children engaged in. So of course they look at globes. They begin to sort of form this notion of the round planet and distances and continents and so forth. So what you see is very young children, which debunks the notion that global competence is only for older kids. So very, very young children trying to make sense of the complexities of geography, if you wish, locating continents, locating landscapes, and around a topic that is of enormous interest to them, because they truly want to send this message to a friend who just moved to Washington, D.C. As they find images of Washington, D.C., they then wonder about whether all cities are alike, all cities like Reggio Emilia. Does Washington, D.C. have the same kinds of pets? Do kids go to school in the same way? Do the schools look the same? So here you see children very naturally beginning to take perspective, trying to understand whether their experience in their own city is similar or different from that of their friend who has just moved. So in a sense, you find very young children engaging in what we might call investigating the world in very meaningful, not rote or routine ways, and what we might call taking perspective. trying to understand the experience of others and understand, therefore, their own experience at radio, in communicating ideas visually and verbally in powerful ways. And eventually they will send a fax to their friend, which would be sort of the beginnings of taking action. Now, clearly, do these kids know that there's the 4 quadrants associated to what they're doing? No, they don't know that. But what they have is a very, very rich experience, which has all of the nuances and complexities of deep learning. And we as educators can distill, hopefully without breaking away the nuance and the richness of this experience, we can distill principles that might be sort of underlying some of these learning experiences for kids.
That's terrific. Tony, we didn't mean to put you on the spot, but is there an example that you feel like you would like to talk about?
One that I'll mention that I don't know if we have a slide for it to say, but I have to do some interesting ideas, and one of the books that is actually drawn.
It's really bad for some reason.
Sorry?
Yeah, we're having a hard time hearing you. Just make sure your microphone's positioned close to your mouth, and let's try again.
It is. Yeah, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, terrific.
Okay, sorry. So it's not one. I'll be quick. It's not one that is a slide for, but it's one that we use in the book to talk about the power of communication and communicating ideas. And it is drawn from an international school in Amsterdam, a high school project. And it's a happening that the students were asked to create, and it had to do with the title of the happening, which is event, do a performance art, if you will, was called "Put Your Culture in a Box and Follow Me." And the point really was to create an experience where people would begin to understand the experience of colonialization and what that meant. And what students did essentially is they had the teachers and the other people who were invited to this event. They sort of engaged in.
I'm so sorry to interrupt again. I really apologize, but your audio is going in and out, and this is strange given that it was so clear just a moment ago. Is there any chance that your microphone has moved?
Well, it is as close as I can get it. Is that any better? I don't know what to do.
Now we're hearing you quite clearly.
Okay, well, I'll try to stay in that exact position. So anyway, I was saying that.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? I was saying that
yes.
The effort here was to sort of communicate to an audience what it's like to be colonized, to be oppressed in a colonial situation. And so the students actually communicated not only verbally, but by actually having the audience become part of the experience. And they sort of communicated the idea of losing one's identity by having the audience deposit their valuables and aspects of their identity in a kind of museum space. And the notion here was to create the understanding that an identity can be taken away from you. And they then spoke to the audience in 4 or 5 different languages all at once, very loudly and very harsh commands, to show that communication can be used not only to communicate but also to create an understanding of one's position and to sort of actualize the hegemony that one has over another. And they also used kind of a multimedia approach to it. They themselves dressed in black, and they had masks on that they indicated, even as they were doing it, that they sort of took away their own identity. One of the students says that we chose masks to symbolize the difference in cultures, and once we put those masks on, we really weren't ourselves anymore. So they were able to sort of use a variety of artistic expressions and modes of expression to communicate, again, a sensitivity to how one is perceived can support the way in which one is able to create dominance over another. And so it really was a very, and I'm probably not doing justice in the way I've described it, but it was a very telling way in which communication they showed their understanding of how communication can be used to affect a social position, and it really was quite I think a telling and stirring example of how communication and a knowledge of communication and its power can be really used to it shows their confidence in that understanding of communication, I would say. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I really want to come back and ask you about the schools, but before we do so, I want to ask Veronica another question. And Veronica, I loved your answer about the grammar of teaching. The second issue for me would be this question of what kind of in-service or pre-service or experiences are valuable to teachers that have to know how to do this kind of work in their classroom? How much do they have to have their own global experiences in order to understand how to bring these kinds of projects into the classroom?
Gosh, you're a good interviewer because you have incredibly good questions, Steve. I think that's a fabulous question, and I think that the short answer is that empirically speaking, in terms of systematic studies of teacher global competence, we know really very little in terms of research. However, there's an enormous amount of sort of practical experience by very sort of illuminated educators from which we can learn. I think that we need to begin with the idea that educating for global competence is actually not just for teachers, not just for students, but for teachers and for the public at large. One of the differences between educating a century ago and educating today is that a century ago we probably had a sense of the direction in which the world was going, and we were charged with educating younger people in order to adapt and participate in a world that was a little bit more predictable for us than the world in which we live today. Today, we need to educate the public for a world that is changing. So everybody needs to learn to adapt. When we think about educating for global competence, we certainly think about kids and youth, but as you well suggest, we need to be thinking about teachers as well in a very, very serious way. There are a few practices, if you wish, that we have seen or that we're beginning to see that have been incredibly helpful. That we have seen as being incredibly helpful. Of course, there's the teachers who have experiences like yours in Brazil, who can travel, sort of the Fulbright. Fulbright teachers, for example, who not only visit other countries, but they collaborate, they study in the best case scenarios. They develop curriculum as they are visiting other countries. So that's certainly something that is very productive. At the same time, we live in a world in which you don't need to go too far away in order to encounter the world, so to speak. I can drive down the street from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to the Chinese neighborhood in Boston, and I will learn enormous amounts. Or the Brazilian neighborhood in Austin, and I'll learn enormous amounts about not only about Brazilian or Chinese cultures, but also about the adaptation of communities who migrate. So we don't need to send teachers to Africa or Sweden in order to prepare them. We simply need to open their minds and their curiosity to visit the neighborhoods around us, so to speak. So that's one sort of more experientially based approach. But another approach has a lot to do with looking very, very carefully at practice and finding those places in their own practice that merit deep reflection and merit focused innovation. So, for example, we're now working with the Portland Public Schools in Maine, And we are working with a collection of teachers across the district. One of the things the teachers are organized in learning communities, so very much like you would expect in sort of professional learning communities across the country. But what's unique about these professional learning communities is that the teachers are documenting the practice. So every conversation is about a particular moment of practice or a particular case of student work that speaks to the issue of global competence. And there's documentation, serious documentation, video, graphic, notes, reflections, that is put at the center of the conversation in order for teachers to explore where their students and where they themselves are advancing global competence or could advance global competence. So there's something to be said about very carefully designed teacher collaboration practices in terms of in-service and pre-service instruction. So I'll stop right there because I know that Tony also has sort of enormous experience in this regard.
If I could just maybe add one quick thing. Yeah, a lot of things, and how am I doing in terms of sound? Can you hear me okay? I will assume so.
You're coming in a little loud, except that when you keep talking, go ahead.
Okay,
it seems to get better as you keep talking.
I just wanted to mention that at Asia Society, we've actually put a lot of work into trying to develop professional development for teachers that actually allows them to, in effect, teach for global competence, as they are also teaching for high performance more broadly. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to create tools for teachers to be able to develop lessons and assessments and so forth that would allow them to know how to forward a curriculum and instruction and assessment program for their students that actually enables or makes plain the kind of outcomes in global competence that they're seeking, and as well as to frame the actual instructional activities in ways that are engaging. They're engaged around interesting global issues and problems, but are also directed towards ensuring that students are gaining the actual competencies, the global competencies that we think are important, that we've outlined in a set of performance outcomes within the various academic disciplines, and having the experience of being able to learn and show what they know at the same time through a kind of performance-based approach. And I think, importantly, the professional development we're trying to develop is itself performance-based. So we want teachers to experience the kind of learning, and then, as we note in the book, the performances of understanding, to actually do those kinds of activities and engage in those kinds of learning assessments themselves, so they will know how, from experience, to develop those for their students. So there are ways that we're trying to move forward on and sort of thinking deeply about how you, in a way that doesn't trivialize global competence and how to teach for global competence, but to help teachers really develop those knowledge and skills that will enable them to do that systematically for their students.
So, Veronica, is there something unique about American culture where we are not only sometimes reluctant to think about global issues, but we're maybe even suspicious of when these are introduced in schools?
Yeah. So the interesting about, as my friend Marcelo Suarez Orozco tends to say, the interesting thing about exceptionalism is that it is such a common characteristic across countries. Every country is exceptional in its own, or considers itself exceptional in its own way. And I think that sort of in America, it's geographic isolation or sort of historical construction of the national identity has really sort of made it not only so that we don't seem to have sort of as part of our public discourse or public orientation, a keen interest in what happens in the world. You pick any young kid in India, Argentina, Italy, they will know much more about what's happening in other, even in terms of youth culture, what's happening in other countries than our youth. You know, of course, I recognize that that's an enormous generalization, but for the most part, it's a pattern that I think holds. The challenge is, you know, how to come to realize and recognize the complexity of this thing we call American culture, and the multitudes that inhabit this land, so that we can come to understand ourselves as enriched by this diversity in deep, serious ways, not just, you know, as not just because it sounds good, but really because we believe it. We believe that there's value in overlapping and coexisting and integrating sort of cultural perspectives, as we have them in America today, or as we have them in the world today. You know, France is a similar phenomenon. You know, we have, you know, France is very mixed. Argentina is very mixed. So it's a matter of recognizing again who we are under a different framework, and that's tough. That's difficult to do.
Tony, I'm interested in how Asia Society has made a very significant commitment here. And as you talk about the school program, I'm interested in how important you think this is. And of course, I'm sort of handing you the opportunity to talk just about sort of what the larger changes are in our world as a whole.
How important global competence is? I get that. I was asking if that was the question you were asking, but I will assume it is. I think, I mean, for a variety of reasons, we try to describe in the book, understanding the world and how it works is actually, we think, an absolutely essential outcome for students from their education for a variety of reasons. I mean, certainly one that everybody can point to immediately is the nature of the economy having changed and becoming global in its orientation. And we know, for example, that 1 in 5 jobs in the United States is in some way or other connected to international trade. And employers will say left and right that if they had people in their employ who were more globally sophisticated, they would profit that much more. But it's even deeper than that. I mean, we have a kind of real change in distribution of labor in this world we live in, where employers are looking for people who can do the job wherever they may find themselves in the world. And so to be able to compete and to be successful in the work environment we live in now, you have to have the capacity, this is the kind of things we talked about in our definition, to collaborate across cultural lines and to have the knowledge and skills of technology to be able to operate within a global environment. So participation in the global economy requires global competence, really, is the bottom line there. But equally important is the changes in the kind of the demographic and the diversity, the demographic makeup and the diversity within our country and within the world societies. I mean, everywhere in the world, immigration and migration are changing the fabric and the nature of societies. I mean, if you actually totaled up all the number of immigrants across the world, it would be if there was just one country, for example, it would be as large, or it would be the 4th largest country in the world, behind China, India, and the United States. So what that means is that every community, from Boston to Buenos Aires, is much more diverse than it has been, and the extent to which young people are able and able to kind of understand and deal with that diversity and not see it as a threat, but rather see it as an opportunity for collaboration and for exchange. That's going to make all the difference for them as individuals, but also our society in broader terms. So I think to be able to be competent in recognizing perspectives and communicating across ideas and working together with other people becomes a backyard issue. Diversity is the new normal, and so young people have to have the capacity to not only try to tolerate that, but really see it as an asset and move forward. But I think also, we recently had this incredible storm in the east, the Superstorm Sandy, and I think it certainly brings the question to the table as to whether or not there is significant climate change going on, and so you have in the world, and so you have the fact that in order to understand that as a global as an issue, whether or not our planet is warming, whether or not there's changes in the climate, these are not phenomena that are localized in any one country. They're global phenomenon, and so if we are going to have a sustainable planet, then people have to have the capacity to think in global terms. So those are three reasons. I think one other reason that I think it's important that sometimes we don't talk about as much is kind of the learning value, or the importance to motivation and to engagement in schools that a focus on global issues brings. You may well know that when students say why they drop out of high school, for example, it isn't because it's too hard or the bar isn't set too high, and certainly not because they think the teachers don't know their stuff. It's because they say it's boring. And we sometimes often say, well, that's just too bad as the way it was when I was a young person. But the fact of the matter is engagement and motivation are hugely important. And what we found is that kind of situating learning within a global context provides a hugely relevant instructional platform within which great instruction can occur. So a global focus adds a level of relevance to learning that I think is not trivial and really, we think, makes a difference in the outcomes, either with regard to global competencies or your Common Core state standards, as it were. So I think there's just a few reasons why we think global competencies, as I said, an essential characteristic of education going forward.
Tony, how have the parents of the students reacted? Oh, yeah, no, please go ahead, Veronica.
I just wanted to sort of underline what Tony said, because I think it's enormously important. So we tend to think about it as sort of as the fact that we have been in the United States so concerned with the achievement gap, which is a very important problem to attend to, that we have in a way forgotten to pay attention to the relevance gap. What is it that students learn in the Phillips academies or in the sort of the elite schools in our country, and what is it that students get to learn in our public schools? So how can we make sure that the gap in terms of learning relevant content is not increasing as we concern ourselves with the achievement gap? And I think that's necessary. It's essential for young people to succeed in the world in which, or to have respectable and realized lives in the world in which we live. And I think that it is also essential for our democracies. If you look at the debates around the elections these days, and the topics for deliberation on the table, sort of the debt is an international issue, migration, an international issue, sustainability and climate change, an international issue. So preparing our youth, preparing our adults, preparing our elderly to have civic deliberations around these issues. It's not a know-it-all or know-nothing, so to speak. It's really about deliberating together. It's really about coming to understand these issues that are assailing our planet together, so that we can come up with solutions together. And I think that's sort of an investment in our capacity to deliberate around these issues is what Tony's after, what we are after, and what I'm hoping those participating in this conversation will be after as well. How do we become a more informed public, able to deliberate around these issues?
Thank you, Veronica. Tony, we're going to go to Q&A now, but I wanted to give you a chance to pitch the specific activities that Asia Society is doing. And I actually made Honor a moderator as well, in case you want to turn some time over to her to talk about it. But obviously you're doing some webinars coming up.
We are, and Honor, if you can speak, I would more than happy for you to talk about this, since this is your main project. Are you able to join us in this role? Great.
Sure. Yes? Hi.
Yes.
So this is our winter lineup. We're very excited to have a webinar for folks who are interested in teacher prep. And we've also been working to reschedule one on an important topic, project-based learning for global education. So we actually have an archive. You can watch a recording of the first of those from last month. And then in January, we hope to have some amazing stories from one of our schools who's working on that. And then in January and February, we'll have some webinars from our Chinese language initiative. And in March, we'll be looking at our expanded learning toolkit and the work that we do with after-school programs and the like. So thanks for that, and I hope to see lots of folks join us for those, as well as our conferences, which we have annually, the National Chinese Language Conference in April, co-sponsored by College Board, and then our Partnership for Global Learning Conference will be held this summer here in New York. And all of that information is available on our website at asiasociety.org, and then the education page.
Thanks, Honor.
Thanks, Honor. And Veronica, I'm going to do the same thing here for you. Do you want to talk a little bit about Project Zero?
Yes, definitely. So Project Zero, thank you for the chance to do so. So Project Zero is a research institute and development institute within the Harvard Graduate School of Education. For those of you who do not know what Project Zero is, and we have a series of global competence relevant institutes coming up. One is, the most immediate one is in March on developing responsible, caring, and balanced youth. This is going to be led by Howard Gardner and Bill Damon, and it's very much a question about the state of mind of our youth, issues of value, issues of citizenship, local, national, global, and that's going to take place in Boston. We have our signature institutes at the university, the Project Zero Classroom and the Future of Learning, and there are a variety of presentations, workshops, and so forth that attend to issues of international or global competence education for the Future of Learning. Last year, half of our participants were from around the world, so it's a very international community there. And we'll have an institute on thinking and learning in the 21st century that will be dealing with cultures, school cultures, and cultures of thinking and cultures of global competence in schools in London in October. So I'd be delighted to see sort of any of you there. Would be happy to continue the conversation face to face.
Okay, so if you have a question for Veronica or Tony, please put it in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. While we're doing so, I'm going to put up the slide for the Global Education Conference and put the link in the chat again, which starts next week and is free and is just a blast. While we're waiting, Veronica, we didn't get to the kind of worksheet type material you had in your slides. Would you like to describe that at all?
Yes, I could do that. Or I was thinking that maybe I could do that. Yeah. Why don't we show them? And I just will refer to what those are. They're coming out of the book that Tony and I wrote. So if you project them, I'll just sort of mention what these are. So there's a chapter in the book that deals with the teaching for global competence. If you go back, Steve, to the previous slide, the one, that's it. So in this particular chapter, we pay attention to the kinds of questions that teachers have to ask. What topics matter most to teach when one educates for global competence. What exactly is it that students will take away, sort of narrowing our goals. What exactly is it students will do to learn, and how will we assess for global competence. So that chapter sort of describes some principles that might serve as guiding posts for teachers interested in designing projects or units that are focused on global competence work. If you move us to the next slide. So that's sort of another example from the book. Honor was great at identifying several of these, and again, it's a reminder. Flossie Chua contributed in the design of this particular one, and it's a reminder of the kinds of things to pay attention to as we are doing designs. If you move to the next one. And the book also includes a collection of experiences. I hesitate to call them activities. They would be thoughtful activities to think with knowledge, if you wish. We call them performances of global competence. And we have identified a few that seem to have been successful or of interest to the teachers with whom we have worked. So there's a collection of good ideas in the book itself.
Steve, there's one question that was raised, I think, by Charlotte Blessing, that has to do with what kind of global competence work is taking place in other countries that I might just quickly respond to. It's very interesting. Other countries are, and we mainly, as you might imagine, have a great deal of contact with countries in Asia. They are very much beginning to realize and to act on the notion that their young people need to be globally competent. In Singapore, for example, it has actually been kind of written into their national goals that their students will have global awareness, and it makes perfect sense in a place like Singapore because it is by its nature a global place. I mean, as they say, there are no domestic flights in Singapore. Everything is global. And so they've made a concerted effort to begin to, in the way that Singaporeans approach education, to be systematic in thinking through, as we have done, what are the characteristics of global competence that they want their students to engage in. It's also quite interesting that they also are quite aware that their teachers, their educators need to become more globally competent. So before you become a principal, for example, in Singapore, you have to study abroad. It's not a question. It is a requirement. And so they understand the need to have their educators begin to develop a broader worldview. And we just recently heard from our colleagues in Shanghai that there's now a new directive that we're literally having to translate from the Chinese to the English, so we will know exactly what it says. But it's really meant to describe what they want their young people to know and be able to do in terms of global competence and how teachers can approach that. So I think there's certainly in the Asian countries that we're most familiar with a growing awareness that global competence is really, really important, and they have a real clear understanding that the future is a shared future between countries in the world, and they want their young people to be ready for that.
Thank you so much, Veronica and Tony. I'm clapping for you. To do so, I'm hovering over the smiley face icon, and then I go down to applause. Really delightful to have you both here. The book is Educating for Global Competence, Preparing Our Youth to Engage the World. It is free to download. You can either go to my blog post, or I'm sure Anna will put the link again in the chat. Really delightful to have you both here. Thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thanks for having us. It's great to be in this conversation.
With both of you.
Would you like me to react to some of
Go ahead, Veronica.
Oh, no. Go ahead.
Courtesy to people, No, as a courtesy, we typically finish on time. So if you'd like to react, let's have you do so. But if those of you who need to leave, please feel free to leave. But if you saw something in the chat, Veronica, that I missed, please go ahead and address it.
Oh, no, simply to underscore Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie. Some folks have seen this video. It's a TED Talk. Highly recommended. Absolutely beautiful work.
Terrific. Okay, thank you both. That was really delightful. Really appreciate it. Don't miss the Global Education Conference next week, globaleducationconference.com. Take care, everybody. Have a great night or day, depending on where you are. Bye now.
Thank you, Steve. Bye-bye.